In the book of 1 Thessalonians, looking at chapter 2, verses 17 through chapter 3, verse 5. 2:17 through 3, verse 5. So, have you thought about persecution? Have you thought about suffering and maybe someday having to suffer for your faith? Maybe someday having to have some sort of conflict because of what you believe, because of your love for Christ? How will you respond when you have to face it? Because the Lord hasn't really promised us an easy life here on earth. The Lord hasn't promised us that everything will be rosy, that if we become believers in Jesus Christ, that life is just going to skate along and we'll all have our 2.5 kids and a Cadillac in the garage and all of that. God hasn't promised that. In fact, He said the opposite, that if we live for Him, we will have to face suffering. If we live for Him, there will be opposition. The world will not like us. The world will oppose us. It'll be different in different ways. I'm not saying here in America that we're going to be martyred as they were in ancient Rome, or as they are right now, maybe in places like Sudan, or other places where if you are a believer, you are taking your life in your hands. But what about when we're facing it or when others are facing it? I'd say the big idea of our passage today is we should be concerned for one another so that we will endure persecution. We should have a concern for one another, for one another's faith, for how we are bearing up under suffering, that concern should be there. But that we shouldn't be surprised when persecution comes, when suffering comes. Let's read our passage, starting in chapter 2, verse 17. But since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again. But Satan hindered us. For what is our hope, or joy, or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at His coming? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, so that no one be moved by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word you have given us. Thank you for inspiring Paul to write these words to the church at Thessalonica. Father, I pray that we would have the same concern for other believers as Paul has for the Thessalonians. That our hearts would be united with other believers, that we would care about them, that we would be concerned for them, and especially for their relation with you. Father, I also pray that we will be ready when suffering comes, that we will be ready for when times get hard, that we would already have made the decision to follow you no matter what happens, that we would already be trusting you when the hard times come. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for loving us through the hard times, and thank you for the hope that we have of a new kingdom, of a heaven someday with you. It's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen. I've heard it said that when we're trying to be prepared for what may come, trying to be prepared for even something like grief. I believe it was D.A. Carson who was at the conference we were at last year with RHMA, that he has written a book on grieving. And he said, the time to share those truths with someone is not when they're grieving. It's long before that they be prepared for it when it comes. And I believe the same can be said for persecution or suffering. That we should be prepared for it and already have our minds made up how we will react long before it comes. Long before it is there with us. Well, we start off that we should be concerned for the faith of other believers. And Paul starts off and says, but since we're torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face. So Paul starts off, he says that we were torn away from you. Literally, this is, we were orphaned from you. And Paul isn't changing his metaphor yet again. In the ancient world, they could use that word orphaned for not just a parent losing a child, but it could also be, or child losing a parent, but it could also be a parent that has lost a child. They would use that same word for that grief, for that, just the grief and the hurt that would come from a parent losing a child. That they would say they also were orphaned, that they were orphans. And Paul says that just as he has said, we were like a mother with you, we were like a father with you, and now we have been orphaned of you. That we have been torn apart. And he says it was for a short time. It wasn't something that took a long time, that it wasn't such a long time between then, but that they were gone only in person, not in heart. You see, others were probably accusing Paul of not caring about the Thessalonians, of, the hard times came, there was a riot. Where was Paul? He just took off. He got out of here. Probably off to fleece some other people to try and get their money. And so Paul has been defending himself through this letter. And Paul has been trying to say, no, that's not what it was. That I did care for you. That we face suffering in other places too. And that he had to go, but they were gone in person. They weren't seeing each other face to face, but that they were not gone in heart. That Paul still cared about them. He still thought about them. He still prayed for them. He still thanked the Lord for them and what he had heard about them. So the Thessalonians were not out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't that Paul got ran out of Thessalonica and he thought, well, I hope they're okay. I can't ever step foot back in that place again. But that he still prayed for them, he still loved them, and he was still genuinely concerned for them. And they wanted to go to them, especially Paul. He said that they had great desire to see them face to face. And he said, because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. Paul wanted to be there. The others wanted to be there. They wanted to go. Eventually they did send Timothy. But they wanted to go and see how they were doing, to strengthen them in their faith. And I'm sure they were cut off so soon, they hadn't finished teaching them yet. They hadn't finished laying the foundation of the doctrines they should know and knowing about Christ and about God and all of those things. They knew some things, but they didn't know everything. But that Satan hindered them from coming. And we're not told what this opposition was. You can speculate all day of what it was, and if you read different commentaries, some do, but that's all it is speculation. The Bible doesn't tell us how Satan hindered. But somehow he did. But evidently the Thessalonians knew. Paul wrote to them, Satan hindered us, and evidently they would have known what Paul meant. But that Paul wanted to see them, but somehow Satan hindered it. And so he asked them a rhetorical question. He says, for what is our hope, or joy, or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? So he asked them, what is our hope? Paul knew eventually he would stand before Christ, that he would be judged for, and the word there is, it's the Bema Seat judgment of Christ, whereas like being judged in the games or something like that is for reward. Not the great white throne judgment, but where Christ is handing out rewards to those who have served him. He says, who is our hope? Or what is their hope? What is their joy? What would bring them real joy? Or what would be something they could boast about before Christ's throne? And who was it? It was the Thessalonians. It was how they had changed, that they would be their crown of boasting. Now we hear crown in English and we think of a king's crown, like usually made of metal that they would wear, and it's a symbol of their authority. But really, this crown, it's a different word. They had two words in Greek. One was where we get our word diadem from. I'm sure you've seen that in some of the older hymns. That is the crown of the king that he would wear as a symbol of his authority. But the other word is Stephanos. And that would be like a crown, like a laurel wreath that the winner in the games would get. And that was like a trophy or a medal. That's what he would get to show his victory. And so, what would be their crown of boasting? He says, is it not you? For you are our glory and joy. You see, Paul's looking to the future of the coming of Christ, but he's also saying, even right now, you are our glory and joy. You bring us joy, even though we have to face suffering, you have faced suffering, but yet they can still have joy, and they still are a glory to them. That the Thessalonians are all of these. And Paul here is relating, he was so worried about them, and we see that here. Thought, oh, what has happened to them? We don't know. We know we face persecution, and they thought, well, the people that threw us out of town are probably not going to treat them much better. And so they were worried about them. So they had sent Timothy, and Timothy came back with a great report. That they were faithful, they loved Christ, and Paul was just rejoicing over how they had turned to Christ, over how through opposition they had turned to Christ and they were faithful. And they would bring the missionaries great glory and joy. And here we have, where it says, at his coming, we have this word parousia. And if you read theology books or something, they'll use this word to talk about Christ's coming. And it almost became a technical term for it, as later writers got to talking about it. But it's interesting that it wasn't that in the New Testament times. It was actually used for the visit of a high-ranking official or even the emperor to a city which would be accompanied with much pomp and ceremony. So the picture here is they would use that word parousia, say if the emperor would come to Thessalonica, and they would talk about his coming and presence with them. And that, that would be a great thing, and they would want to honor the emperor, and they would feel honored that the emperor came to him. So really this word, it is used of the second coming of Christ as King of the earth, as King of kings and Lord of lords, as he comes and sets up his kingdom. That is what the word is talking about. Not as much the rapture of the church, but when Christ comes and sets up his kingdom. That he is coming as the king, that it is a royal visit, a royal presence, that when he comes and sets up his kingdom. And it was used several other times in the New Testament for the coming of people who were not Jesus Christ. And so that's where it was not a technical term yet in that, but it is a picture of Christ coming. It is a picture of him coming and setting up his kingdom. And they were saying, when Christ comes and sets up his kingdom, what will bring Paul joy? It'll be able to say, I told them about you, and they believed even through persecution. That they believed even though they had to suffer. And that would bring Paul joy to point to them when Christ came. So how do we apply this? Well, first of all, we can see Paul's heart in this paragraph. We can see his love and care for this church. He loved these disciples. Paul wasn't someone who was just a cold, indifferent preacher. He was not someone that would just, put a tick on the tally board for, hey, we had 300 souls saved, and then never see him again. That wasn't Paul. Paul loved and cared for them, and he wanted to pour his life into them. We should have this same kind of concern for one another. That when one of us hurts, all of us hurt. When one of us suffers, we all suffer with that person. We care for that person. We seek out their well-being, that we would care for them and love them and try and help establish them in the faith. That we should have this kind of concern for one another and also for those we lead to Christ. It's sad to say, I've had a few people I've had the privilege of telling about Christ, and they have, prayed the prayer, but yet I don't know where they are now. And that's sad. That to not know where are they, how are they doing, and all of that, that we should have the same kind of concern Paul had for those we talk to, and for those that we know, and those who are a part of our church. Secondly, we should not be surprised by persecution. So we should have genuine concern about others that are believers, and also know that don't be surprised when suffering comes. It will come. So don't be surprised by it. Verses 1 through 5 of chapter 3. Paul says, "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions." So he starts off here, he says, you know what, we can bear it no longer. They were concerned for them. They had heard about them. You know, this is the day before cell phones. This is the day before email and internet and worldwide instant coverage of news and all of those things. Say the day that the tornado tore through Washington, Illinois. That's the same town of the people that came and helped redo our church building here. We heard about it when we went home for church. Shannon got a message on her phone from her sister, and it said, "Church is in the basement, we're okay." And we thought, what? Was there a big sinkhole? What happened? But she meant they went down in the basement because there were tornadoes. But that's kind of the limit of text messaging, I guess. You don't get to really express yourself. But instantly, we were able to know and talk with family, call them and say, oh, okay, our family's safe. And, we were able to know that. But if you can imagine what that would be like, even back before the telegraph was invented. You get a letter from someone saying, oh, there was a tornado that tore through here. You think, well, I haven't heard from my sister. I haven't heard from a brother or parents or those things. Think, well, are they okay? That kind of anxiety, that's what Paul had. There wasn't that instant communication. And so when they could bear it no longer, he and Silas decided to be left alone, and they sent Timothy from Athens. And you'll notice if you follow along in Acts, this doesn't strictly follow the text. We see that Paul, he had to leave. He went to Athens, and he sent then for Silas and Timothy to come join him in Athens, but then we don't see of them joining in Corinth. So evidently what happened is, Luke, as he's editing his book and deciding what to include and what not to include, he didn't include Silas and Timothy coming and joining Paul in Athens and then going out again. And Silas maybe was sent out again somewhere else, even from Athens, so that Paul was alone there and then went to Corinth. And so he and Silas, they were willing to be left alone, and they sent Timothy. It was hard for them to do. Timothy was valuable to them. And so they sent Timothy to him, and they described him as a brother, that he was their brother in the faith. He was a co-worker of Paul's, but he was also a co-worker of God's in the spread of the gospel. And that's a little strange wording. I don't know, those of you with different versions, if it says something else, because you go into the manuscripts and there are different ways or different words there. Some say God's servant, others will just say a co-worker and they drop God, or those sorts of things. And it's a strange term to think about. You think, well, co-worker, that almost sounds like equal footing, so how can you be God's co-worker? But it's the idea of working with God. It's the idea of helping build His kingdom. And there are other places where that word is used. Paul called himself God's fellow worker in 1 Corinthians 3:9. So this isn't the only place that happens, but that Paul also calls himself that. So Timothy is God's co-worker, and it is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is in spreading the good news of Jesus Christ and His death on the cross and His resurrection and the forgiveness of sin that he was spreading that good news. And Paul sent him with a purpose, that it was to establish and exhort you in the faith. So he wanted Timothy to go, establish them, exhort them. In other words, to finish the work of teaching them the basics of Christianity. They were run out of town before they could finish. And so there were questions that the Thessalonians had. We'll see later, they had questions about Christ coming again, and they thought, well, if our loved ones have died, are they going to miss out on it? What's going to happen? They didn't know. And so Paul wrote back to them in this letter to help establish some of those things. So he went there, Timothy established them in their faith, exhorted them in their faith, but also that they would not be moved by their afflictions. It is hard when you are suffering to hang in there. It is hard to hang in there when times get tough. And he did not want them to be moved. And this word move, it originally meant like the tail wagging of a dog. So some have taken this to mean that others would come and maybe try and flatter them or try and get them to give up Christianity, but more in a friendly way. You could think of a pagan friend that, it's, hey, you're becoming a fanatic with this. You're having to suffer for this. Why not just give it up? You're going to have to suffer. And out of genuine concern for them, that might be hard to endure. But others look at it as like being shaken by that affliction. That the affliction itself would shake them. And so either way, the word kind of evolved over time from tail wagging the dog to like a flattery to then just being shaken, moving back and forth. But either one, I think, can fit the context of that they would not be divert from their faith because of the suffering. And Paul reminded them that they are destined for suffering. He says, for you yourselves know that we are destined for this. It wasn't a surprise to God that the church would suffer. It wasn't a surprise to God that the people of Thessalonica had an uprising against them. That didn't surprise God. God knew it was going to happen. And in fact, Paul gets pretty strong language here and says, not only did it not surprise God, it was destined to happen. It was part of his plan. That God allowed them to suffer. That God allowed that hurt to come. And so Paul reminded them, hey, we're destined for this. It's going to happen. And I think we can even put us in there that if we are living for Christ, we may one day be faced with a choice, follow Christ or follow someone else. And I imagine that suffering will go along with following Christ. What kind of suffering? I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I don't claim to be. But I think it's safe to say there are times when following Christ leads to suffering. And that may come in our lives, and we will have to make the right choice and be ready to make that choice. And know it doesn't surprise God when it comes. And it shouldn't surprise us either. And Paul even mentions that it was prophesied among them. He says, for when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass and just as you know. So the wording here, it sounds like a prophecy. It says that we told you beforehand, and that they were given a word of prophecy that suffering is going to come. It will come, so be ready for it. And so Paul is saying, don't let that suffering shake you. We told you it was coming. And, well, now that you're suffering, you see that it did. That our word was true to you, that it would happen, and it did happen. And that they should not be shaken for this. And he said, for this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. So because Paul knew they'd be suffering, he sent Timothy. He wanted Timothy to check on their faith. He wanted to see, are they hanging in there, or have they just given up on Christ? Were they hanging in there? Were they enduring suffering? Or did they recant and say, oh, okay, I don't believe that anymore, and didn't have to suffer anymore? And Paul feared that Satan, who is here called the tempter, may have tempted them to give up their faith. You see, Paul wasn't with them long. We don't know exactly how long, but he wasn't with them long. And he was afraid that, was it real? Did they really trust Christ? He didn't see their faith tested before he was kicked out of town. And so he did worry about that. He didn't know their faith, or he didn't see it play out over time. And I think this is an application of Matthew 13, 3-9, the parable of the sower. They remember Jesus told the story, a sower goes out to sow, and some seed fell on the hard path, where the footpath was packed down. It couldn't really get root in there. The birds came, ate it. That some seed fell among the thorns, and as it grew up, it was choked out and died. That some seed fell among the rocks, and it sprang up quick, but then when the sun came out, it dried up and died. But some fell on the good soil. And so that Paul was fearful of, man, did it fall on bad soil? Did they just spring up quick, and then when persecution comes, they'll just wilt and die? But that is not what happened. They believed, and they trusted Christ. You see, there are those that say they believe, but when the going gets tough, they fall away. As John said, when there was a big exodus from the church, that, you know what, they went out of us because they were not, or they went out from us because they were not of us. They're just showing their true colors. That when hard times come, that's really when we see true colors. So how do we apply this? Well, I think we see Paul's concern here also. He was concerned for their faith. He was concerned for their faithfulness. But we also see that suffering will come. Suffering is a part of life for the believer. We need to be ready for it. So are you ready for it? Will you endure it? Will you make the choice now that when it comes, I will not give up. I will not give in. But I will face the fire. I believe I shared last week the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had already made that choice, and they faced the fire. And that they chose rather to be cast into a furnace than to bow down and worship an image. And I'm sure it would have been easy for them to think, you know, let's just go through the motions while Nebuchadnezzar's watching us. I mean, we're not really going to worship this. We'll just make it look like we are, and it won't be a big deal. But no. They remained true to God. And they had to suffer for it. Now, God delivered them, but God doesn't promise to deliver everybody through suffering like He did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sometimes you have to go through it. And we need to be ready for it. Let's pray. Father, thank you that people do matter. Thank you that our faith is not one that is just head knowledge, it's not just intellectual, but it is one that is lived out in real life. And Father, I pray that your concerns would be our concerns. That just as Paul was concerned for the believers at Thessalonica, so we would be concerned for one another and for how we are living out the faith. And Father, I pray that we would also be prepared for when suffering comes. That we would be prepared when we have to make a choice of the easy way or the hard way, that we would choose you. Father, I pray that you would give us courage in those times. Give us the courage of our convictions. It is in the name of Jesus Christ that we pray. Amen.